Good evening, everybody. We will start the meeting now. I was just a bit delayed because I had an impression that there was a link in Meet UIB that was not working. But I will start now. To introduce Polly Ericksen, we are very happy to have her as a lecturer here in the Bergen Summer Research School. She leads the research program on sustainable livestock systems at the International Livestock Research Institute, which is located in Nairobi. This is part of the CGIAR system, which is a global partnership united international organizations engaged in research about food security. And she gave a lecture to our students in the Global Food Systems course on theoretical perspectives on food systems yesterday. And Polly Ericksen, she is truly interdisciplinary in her research. She actually has a bachelor in history. She has a master's in economics and a PhD in soil science from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. She has over 20 years of experience working on agricultural development, natural resource management, and global environmental change in developing countries. This includes experience working in the World Agroforestry Center, Catholic Relief Service, at the Columbia University's International Research Institute for Climate and Society, and at the University of Oxford, working with the Global Environmental Change and Food Systems initiatives of the Earth Systems Science Partnership. Today, she's going to talk about her research on livestock agri-food systems and on climate smart livestock systems. So with that, I will give the word to you, Polly. Are you with us from Nairobi?
Yes,
yes.
Thank you.
Hello.
Thanks, everybody. Hello, how are you all? Thank you so much for making the time and joining me today. So I'm going to start sharing my screen, and I'll turn off the video while I do that, since I'm delivering this from home. And then when my presentation is over, I'll put the video back on, and I'll be available for questions and answers. Either you can raise your hand or you can ask questions in the chat. So thank you. Okay, so as part of this summer school, I was asked to talk a little bit about the research that I and the people in the research program that I lead at ILRI do with a particular sort of focus on how our research contributes to ongoing important development processes. And so I thought it would be interesting for you all to hear about what we're doing around the notion of climate smart livestock development. And so I'll walk through some concepts, and I'll also give some practical examples from ongoing research that we're engaged in. So some of you may be familiar with the notion of climate smart agriculture. This is a concept that was launched by several of the major donors and actors in the agriculture and climate change space, namely the FAO, the World Bank, and the CGIAR itself, which is part of the research system, which is the research system that ILRI, where I work, is part of. And so the idea with this concept of climate smart agriculture was really to mainstream climate change into the agricultural development work that many of the CGIAR and FAO programs were already involved in. So you can sort of think of this top box, increase agricultural productivity in order to improve food security, as one of the main missions, if you will, of many international agricultural research organizations around the world. But what they realized with the challenge of climate change was that there were two other pillars that we needed to consider when also thinking about how to ensure food security. The first was to think about how to mitigate greenhouse gas emissions from agriculture or through agriculture and other natural resource management interventions. And the third was to think about the need to adapt production to climate change. So you can see that those three pillars, as indicated by these black arrows, are now the three pillars of climate smart agriculture, and they're all trying to contribute to this central mission of improving food security. But to complicate matters, we need to focus on these green bidirectional arrows, where you'll see that there are interactions between increasing agricultural productivity, mitigating greenhouse gas emissions, and adapting to climate change. Some of these interactions are synergistic, and we can achieve what we think of as win-win-win situations where we're able to increase productivity, mitigate greenhouse gas emissions, adapt to climate change, and still ensure food security. But in many other cases, we face trade-offs where we may increase productivity but not be able to mitigate emissions or adapt to climate change. So let's perhaps try to think of what examples of some of these trade-offs might be. So let's say that it makes sense to increase yields with fertilizers, particularly, let's say, in sub-Saharan Africa, where many of our soils are very deficient in phosphorus and nitrogen. But in doing so, we will increase greenhouse gas emissions from those cropping systems because nitrous oxide is a byproduct of chemical fertilizers. But let's say that we decide that it's going to make sense to plant shorter duration varieties because the length of the growing period is going to decrease as climate change advances. But there's evidence that some of those short duration varieties actually have lower nutritional quality than some of the more traditional varieties. Or another example could be that we want to certify beef as low emissions in order to try to provide incentives to farmers and educate consumers, but in doing so, we increase the price of that beef. Or we think about trade as a very logical option for adapting to changing climates. And we sometimes trade more food, but that then results perhaps in decreasing local incomes from agriculture. And I'm sure that you can think of many more. So now let's think about livestock and why I want to talk about the idea of climate smart, quote unquote, livestock development. So livestock are a really important source of livelihoods in low and middle income countries across Latin America, sub-Saharan Africa, and Asia. And it's really important to understand the role of livestock, in particular in relation to these 3 points. So for many rural people, investing in livestock is one of the quickest pathways out of poverty. They're an extremely high value asset that allow you to accumulate savings, if you will, in the form of livestock, so that when you need to sell them, you have a quick access to cash income. There are many opportunities for women to be involved in livestock production, particularly through poultry or small ruminants, or in some cases dairy production. And as I've already said, they have a significantly higher value than crops. We've, however, found in our engagement with agricultural and climate change initiatives across the CGIAR that livestock are actually relatively neglected compared to crops. So I have a colleague who's working at the moment on the next agricultural impact assessment for AR6 of the IPCC, and he's in charge of writing about what we've learned about how climate change may have an impact on livestock. And he's found that only a fraction of the articles published about the challenges climate change poses for agriculture pertain to livestock. I mean, somewhere between 10 to 20%, which, given the role and the importance of livestock in so many agricultural households and systems, is quite small. Some of the reasons for this might be that livestock are more complicated to understand than crops. First of all, they're mobile. Second of all, it's not just that climate change will affect livestock through heat stress or changes in precipitation variability, but it will affect the feed and fodder availability. So it's much more complicated to model how climate change will interact with livestock systems. Third, they perform multiple functions beyond just providing household income and nutritionally dense foods. And then last, they're quite a critical asset that farmers and other household members use to buffer themselves in times of shock. So they actually manage their livestock assets differently than they do their crop products. It's also true that the climate models are quite limited in terms of how specific and precise they can be, and I'll come back to this in a minute. But then I think one of the biggest challenges that we have faced is that we have to acknowledge that livestock themselves contribute to climate change. So climate change is a bit of a double-edged sword, if you will, for livestock producers and livestock systems. So here is a slide from a report that FAO and Francesco Tubiello put out with colleagues in 2014, trying to summarize the contribution of livestock to global greenhouse gas emissions. So many of you may be familiar with the estimate that livestock contribute between 10 and 14.5% of anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions. But when it comes to agriculture, as you'll see from this slide, about 65% of agricultural emissions are related to livestock production. And that's largely due to these four main areas. First, and by far the biggest, 40%, is enteric fermentation, which is the methane that's released when ruminants, so that's goats, sheep, cows, digest. The second largest is manure that gets left on pasture. A smaller contribution of only about 7% comes from manure management. And then the last, the smallest portion from livestock is the manure that's applied to soils. We're also worried about livestock and greenhouse gas emissions across low and middle income countries in the tropics because of this graph. So this is a graph that's showing greenhouse gas emissions intensities. So greenhouse gas emissions per, in this case, kilogram of protein. Okay, this is the usual metric that is often calculated when trying to understand emissions per product or the environmental footprint of a given food item. And what you'll see is that these intensities are extremely high in much of sub-Saharan Africa, parts of Latin America, and parts of South and Southeast Asia. So when you couple this with the fact that demand for livestock products is increasing quite rapidly, again, across low and middle income countries, we start to worry. Because if these emissions intensities don't come down, then total emissions will go up as livestock demand grows. However, we see in this quite an interesting research challenge for us because many of those estimates come from models that use data that are derived from OECD livestock production systems. And so in those systems, as you'll see, there's a very strong and linear relationship between the intake that an animal does, the digestibility of what the animal is eating, and enteric methane production. So as diets increase beyond maintenance to 2 or 3 times maintenance, the emissions intensities go down. And we know that quite clearly. The problem in sub-Saharan Africa is that livestock are fed at sub-maintenance levels for much of the year because we have incredible seasonal variability. So you'll see here that if you take that dotted line as animals being fed at maintenance, that for much of the year, more than half of it, and most animals, in this case in East Africa, are fed well below maintenance levels. And the challenge is that we don't know anything about the relationship between improving intake and digestibility and reducing emissions intensities. So what that results in is that countries, for example, in sub-Saharan Africa, are relying on data that are producing incorrect greenhouse gas emissions inventories. So we invested about 5 years ago in a laboratory here at our Nairobi campus, where we can actually do both field-based as well as laboratory measurements of greenhouse gas emissions from ruminant digestion as well as soils and manure. So if you look on on the left-hand side, if you will, the estimates are that for industrial systems, you get emissions factors of between 60 to 160 kilograms per head per year. Before we started publishing our data in 2018, there was 1 or 2 studies available for sub-Saharan Africa, only using tier 1 methods. And this paper estimated about 42. So you can see that estimated lower than for industrial systems. We've now are producing a series of papers looking at tier 2 emissions factors for smallholders, in this case in Kenya. And you'll see quite a difference depending on if it's an intensive or a semi-intensive system. So why is it so important that we're producing tier 2 emissions factors using actual data? I'll come to that in a minute. This graph is just showing that we also look quite a bit at nitrous oxide emissions from manure, because nitrous oxide emissions will vary depending not just on the management, but also on the diet that the animal is eating. So here you'll see we were feeding animals 3 diets, 120% of maintenance energy requirement, 160. And actually for manure, in all cases, our estimates were lower than the default emissions factor from the IPCC. So these data are in really high demand from the IPCC because there are so few studies from Sub-Saharan Africa, as well as many parts of Asia. So yeah, so back to my point about why is it so important for countries to have these better emission estimates? Well, first of all, because many countries that depend on agriculture have need to realize that in order to meet emissions reductions targets from the agricultural sector, they need to include livestock. Because as I've already shown you, livestock account for such a large percentage of agricultural emissions. But if they want to be able to measure the impact of any kind of intervention on their greenhouse gas emissions, they need to develop what we refer to as tier 2, at a minimum, types of estimates. And you can only do that if you have in situ data, activity data, and emissions factors data from real systems. And then complicating things even more is that although many countries have committed to emissions reductions in their NDCs, they need to attract climate finance in order to implement any of those strategies. And it's very hard to attract international climate finance if you can't show the impact that you're having, particularly on greenhouse gas emissions reductions. So that's why that's such an important research agenda for us. But now let's turn to the flip side, which is thinking about the major impacts that climate change will have on livestock production. So climate change will affect livestock production directly. Heat-stressed animals, we know, digest less efficiently. We know that feed and fodder availability will be affected as climate patterns change. And given that I work at an institute that focuses on improving animal productivity, I can tell you that feed and fodder availability and quality is the single biggest constraint to improving productivity in smallholder livestock systems. Third, we know that pest and disease distributions will change as a result of climate change. And after feed and fodder, disease is the biggest concern of many smallholder livestock producers. And then finally, we know that resource governance arrangements will need to adapt to climate change. And as I've said, because the role of livestock in many smallholder agricultural systems is rather complicated, thinking of how to adapt those resource governance arrangements is additionally complicated. So this is a slide that a postdoc working at KIT and Garmisch has been developing with several other colleagues of mine. And what it's showing you is estimates under 2 of the global climate modeled scenarios. The one on the left is RCP 4.5, so you can think of that as a more moderate increase in temperature by 2100. On the right is RCP 8.5, which is a more extreme scenario. And on the top, you can see the impacts on production of the primary livestock products, eggs, poultry, pork, mutton, milk, and beef. And you can see that for every single one of these scenarios, by 2050, we will see significant impacts on livestock productivity. And of course, by 2100, it will be even greater. So we know that these significant impacts are coming. So what are some of the challenges then in thinking about how to adapt livestock production systems to climate change? Well, the first are limits to climate science and the advances that will be made in the next few years. So as some of you may be aware, currently many of the climate projections are based on global and regional climate models. They have very poor spatial and temporal resolution. So it's very difficult to downscale those modeled results to anything like a country level or a sub-national level. So it means it's very hard, it's impossible for policymakers to know exactly what heat, and it's a bit easier for heat, but particularly precipitation and growing season duration. It's really difficult to say what the future will hold. And so there are limits to predictability. And there are some really key gaps that we don't understand around agricultural impacts. For example, we've done very little research about climate change risks in food supply chains. Many of the global climate models tell us about trends, but they don't tell us about the likelihood of extreme climate events beyond that there will be more variability. So we're not very good at thinking about what the impacts of extreme climate events on food systems are. We don't understand very well the effects of ozone and other factors like increased CO2, temperature, moisture, and light on many of the feeds and forage crops that livestock depend on. And as I've already said, it's very hard to model what climate change impacts will be for insects, pests, and diseases because there are other vectors, ecosystem and human alike involved in those transmission patterns. But we still need to focus on adaptation. In spite of the uncertainty in climate science, livestock producers, traders, processors, and retailers need to adapt to future climate change. So what are some of the ways that our research for development can help? Let me just spend 2 minutes on a couple of definitions that are important to distinguish between when you think about enhancing or fostering adaptation in livestock systems. So the first is adaptive capacity, which is just very simply the ability of a system to adjust to climate change, to moderate potential damages, to take advantages of opportunities, or to cope with the consequences. But this is a very sort of agent-oriented thing. You're building the capacity of a person, a household, or in some cases, a system. We should probably distinguish that from adaptation as a long-term activity. And here it's important to distinguish between incremental adaptation, which some of my economics colleagues argue farmers do automatically anyway, so we don't need to, so we should just allow adaptation to happen. And this can be described as a subtle shift in a livelihood practice. And so an example would be adopting drought-resistant breeds. But many are increasingly saying that climate change will bring around about such fundamental changes in what can be grown, what can be cultivated, that we need to think about transformative adaptation. So this is a much more fundamental shift in the nature of a livelihood. And an example here would be switching from herding to agriculture. So one of the promising interventions that ILRI has been working on for over a decade, just to give you an idea of how long it can take to develop some of these promising interventions in the livestock sector. So index-based livestock insurance, it's an innovation that is intended to provide better risk protection, and it's increasingly viewed as a viable alternative to humanitarian relief. And this is because it's aimed at helping vulnerable pastoral populations from losing too many livestock in the cases of droughts. So, but it also offers the potential to crowd in investment and asset accumulation. So you can see that in addition to helping people cope with a given shock at a certain time, it also has this sort of longer term resilience building possibility. The way it works is that we use satellite imagery to assess forage availability. We do that using units of insurance to take into account livestock migration patterns, and you can see some of those example maps. But the important thing is that we've adapted this product over time so that we provide compensation early in the season to minimize livestock losses. So it's an intervention that provides asset protection. And you'll see that we've done a few impact evaluation studies. This is after the short range drought in Kenya in 2016 and a long range drought in 2017. CLIP refers to the Kenya Livestock Insurance Program, which our research on IBLI has evolved into. So the question is there anything you spent money on? And you'll see that in both cases, they were able to spend money on food. So they avoided livestock sales because they had money to spend on food. They spent money on forage and fodder for their animals. They spent money on veterinary services. They spent money on water for their animals. So that we really are seeing benefits from IBLI. So that sounds great, but there are a number of constraints for a product like IBLI to reach scale. First off is that pastoralists are an extremely difficult client base to reach. They're often in remote locations. They have no experience with any kind of insurance product. We've spent a lot of time explaining what IBLI does and doesn't do. The private sector is a critical partner in this because we need insurance companies to sell the product. And they lacked the capacity, both with this kind of product, with an index-based product, and clientele as hard to reach as pastoralists. It's a very high-risk product for them unless it goes to scale. And for that to happen, we really need government support. And increasingly, we're talking not just about national government support, but also getting regional bodies, such as EGAD in the case of the Horn of Africa, to support this. And then we need to sell this to donors. We need them to believe that over the long run, a resilience building initiative like IBLI will be cost effective relative to humanitarian relief. Turning to maybe a more traditional kind of intervention for the CGIAR, we talk a lot with our colleague, with our geneticist colleagues, about what are the potential for breeding our way out of climate change or producing better adapted breeds. And again, I want to stress here that the time horizon for developing, for doing breeding-based interventions, again, is around 10 years in the case of livestock. And some of the challenges that we face here, for example, are around the difficulties in doing trait selection for adaptation. So the first one is that you might select for higher milk production, but that actually increases cattle's vulnerability to heat stress because they're using their energy to produce milk, not to cool. It's actually challenging to be able to measure the adaptation traits in order for genetic selection. And this is because, unlike Europe or Australia or the US, we still don't have a lot of the basic data about genetic diversity and the traits to which it's linked across the tropics. And this is something that my own research institute invests a lot of time and effort into. And then I just want to remind us all that for both interventions to mitigate the impacts of climate change, but also to adapt to climate change, we need to think very significantly about the equity implications. So we have a number of students doing PhDs with us in various different projects. And so this is some research from one of our students working in Tanzania. And so what you see in this graph is that within the same community, there was a tremendous diversity in the types of livestock keeping households that we found. So there were low asset households, there were dairy intensifying households, there were households that were trying to diversify their production, there were households that depended heavily on off-farm and livestock income, and then there were households that were largely food crop dependent. So why is this important? Because other work that we've been doing, for example, with trying to assess the feasibility of helping farmers to adopt improved forages, which seems like a very low-hanging fruit, both for reducing greenhouse gas emissions, but also trying to adapt to climate change. And we find that there are a number of barriers that farmers face. There's very low availability of land to grow forages. Many farmers already have diversified cropping strategies, and it's a challenge for them to incorporate forages into that. And then we face low accessibility of improved planting materials. So while you might think that climate finance could be a way to bring about new incentives to help stimulate greater adoption, there hasn't been a lot of work done on this, but some of the ideas that we were suggesting were field trials to improve farmer awareness, investments to stimulate the development of fodder seed value chains, and then helping farmers to do some financial evaluation of whether they should remain diversified or if it might be more sensible to start to specialize. Because what we're lacking, for example, in East Africa is the development of fodder markets. And that's, again, a real constraint. So lastly, I want to think a bit about some work that we're doing with policy and decision makers at a bit of a higher level. And this is particularly exciting work. And it's basically using tools to help decision makers think about new futures, because given all of the uncertainty, it's very hard to make decisions about and to anticipate future climate change. But if we don't do that, we won't be able to adapt and still ensure food security. And I really like this picture because it sort of says, if you don't change direction, you might end up where you're heading. So this is what we're trying to help people think about. So I've been doing this now with colleagues for about 15 years, and the approach that they use and that I'm now using in some of our work at ILRI is to use the idea of futures or scenarios, which are concrete but diverse future narratives. So you need to recognize that depending on your perspective and your location in the world, we all have multiple pasts, yeah? And so we're all currently living in multiple presents. So when we start to think about what a broadly uncertain future might bring, we need multiple narratives to think about that future. So one way that we used to do this was this, and some of you may have seen this before, which was sort of to say, okay, what are some of the major uncertainties that decision makers, in this case in East Africa, think are really important to influencing agricultural and food security outcomes. So the axes that this group of stakeholders decided were important were the vertical one, how regionally integrated would the East African community be? Would it be tightly integrated or would it be highly fragmented? And then on the horizontal axis, we see a difference in how proactive governments are in reacting to environmental and food security crises versus how reactive they are. And so you often will see this kind of contrasting four storylines where in the upper left-hand quadrant, industrious ants, you have regional integration and proactive governance. So everything is good. Governments respond and they cooperate with one another. And that contrasts with the lower right-hand quadrant where you have fragmented status quo and you have very reactive governance. So in this case, we called it sleeping lions, where governments don't cooperate, they're very reactive. And so in this particular storyline, you see these fat vultures coming in and taking advantage of smallholder farmers. But more recently, people have started to say that it's not so useful to focus on kind of these very predictable four quadrants that contrast in kind of predictable ways and that often reflect the biases of the key stakeholders in the room. So you end up seeing the future that people think is real. What might be more helpful is what we're starting to do now, and this is building on work that some colleagues have been doing with a network known as the Good Anthropocenes Network. My colleague Laura Pereira has been doing this with another colleague, Jos Verwoerd from University of Utrecht, in some European Union funded projects, and also in some very interesting initiatives called Sustainable Food Labs. So I know there's a lot in this graph, but basically this is focusing on thinking about what are the desirable futures that we'd like to see. So you'll see that these have really nice names like global knowledge for local management, wild and teleconnected sharing economies, creative and collaborative, the League of Cooperative Communities. And so the way we develop these storylines is we focus over here on the left-hand side with what are seeds that are currently real, that exist today? What are initiatives or movements that we're seeing in the communities, in the countries where we're developing scenarios? What are some positive seeds that could help us grow into the future that we'd like to have happen in spite of the key uncertainties and crises like climate change, food and water scarcity, economic shocks, and refugees? So we focus on the enabling conditions that we'd like to try to develop, and we build narratives around what needs to happen for those enabling conditions to exist. So this is sort of the really exciting work that we're trying to do currently with national stakeholders and also some local communities across East Africa at the moment. And so I'm going to leave it there because I've run out of time and open it up for questions and answers. So thank you very much. And I want to stop sharing.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you very much, Polly. Yeah, and there we can see you too. I think that was a great lecture. And
Thank you.
On a topic that maybe many of us are not so aware, you know, about how climate change might pose challenges to very vulnerable groups, and you know, with livelihood implications and equity implications and consumption implications also, I suppose. So that was really an eye-opener, I think. I will not keep on talking much because we have questions here. Should I read them or loud, or will you read them? Or
so there's the chat. But then there's also the Q&A. Okay.
Yes, there's the Q&A. So let's start with them. I can read them, perhaps.
Okay.
Yeah.
Right.
Is Håvard Håstad, he writes, thanks for a clear and to the point lecture. When we talk about livestock in the climate debate, the solution is often to reduce meat consumption. But this doesn't take into account how livestock is important to many people's livelihoods. Any reflections on this?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you for that. I mean, that's a question that we struggle with quite a lot. And so I think the point really is that the solutions for one group of consumers or one farming system are quite different. And so what might be sensible recipes for countries like the United States or parts of Europe where we overconsume meat, to be honest, are very different from the implications for many of the smallholder rural populations that ILRI works with. And so yeah. So, for example, I was just reading a paper yesterday that someone shared where a group of Indian researchers compared the standard average Indian person's diet to the Eat Lancet diet, and they found that Indians actually overconsume grains. So that, and we were actually talking about this yesterday, that for many poorer households, they overconsume cheap calories at the expense of fruits and vegetables and animal source nutrition. Yeah, and I guess so that would sort of be my immediate answer. There's another question in the chat box about focus on the ecological differences regarding climate change. I wonder if that person could expand on that question a bit. Or she can't, or perhaps in the chat box. You mean ecological differences between between geographies or agroecosystem types? So yes, I mean, so for example, yeah, and I'm sorry, I realize that you guys can't actually speak. So if you have additions, you have to type it in the chat box. But so again, some colleagues and I have worked on understanding the impacts of climate change across different agroecosystems or different livestock production systems, using some simple parameters like reduction in growing degree days, or what would happen when maximum temperature flips from below 30 degrees Celsius to above 30 degrees Celsius. What might that mean for specific crop types, as I said already, less for livestock production systems, but so the modeling tends to be done for key crops, or in some cases for grazing lands, or for specific feed and forage types. I hope that's answering your question. So we're open for more if there are more. Someone raised his hand. I don't know if someone has to, I don't know if you're allowed to raise your hand. I was told that only 3 of us could speak. So you might need to put your question into the Q&A. Oh, I see it there. Okay. So a question from Peter. Is the work of ILRI also looking at livestock keeping strategies with respect to their soil carbon storage features? So yes, Peter. We do both. We look at, and it's not just ILRI, we work in collaboration with a couple of the other CG centers, CIAT and ICARTA and ICRISAT. So we do work on soil carbon storage, the benefits from improved manure management. We do quite a lot of work on emissions from manure management and different kind of soil carbon amendments in a range of cropping systems. We have on-farm trials going on right now where we're looking at mixed legume intercropping. We're looking at biochar, we're looking at manure, we're looking at manure plus some fertilizer. And then the other issue that's much harder to focus on, but that we are trying to get at, is soil carbon benefits from improved grazing management, because there's tremendous interest in the potential of sequestering carbon in rangelands, largely because of the extent to which because they cover such large areas. And there it's more complicated, because in more temperate ecosystems, it's easier there's greater potential for storing soil carbon. But in some of the dryland systems where we work, I think we're coming up with the recommendation that it's better to focus on keeping the carbon in the rangelands rather than trying to sequester additional carbon, because the marginal benefits are quite small, because the systems are so dry and there's such precipitation variability.
Yeah, so
Yes.
Fasilat, she tried to expand a little bit on what she meant about the ecological zones. I think she means that, you know, that East Africa has a lot of variation. So the problem with regards to climate change might also be very variable.
Exactly, and so that's
she means that.
Yeah. So Fasilat, that's what I meant by saying that when we try to look at the impacts of climate change for different agroecological zones. Oh, now she's saying I answered her question. Yeah. And we also tried to specify that a bit, not just by agroecological zone, but also by dominant production system type. So I don't know if any of you are familiar with the classic book that all livestock modelers use is the 2011 FAO Robinson et al. Book, where they're like 12 types of livestock production systems, and they vary by precip, by temperature. Yeah, and so that's how we do the climate change modeling. Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, then there is a very interesting question here from Tone Rusdal. Aren't emissions from livestock in Africa a drop in the ocean compared to the bigger global conventional livestock farming, thus a misdirected effort in terms of limiting greenhouse gas emissions?
Yeah, we get that question a lot as well. And your answer is yes, they are. But the concern comes, and sometimes when I give these talks, I show the projections of increase in livestock demand. And so the most of the increase in that demand is coming from Sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia, China and Brazil. But even if you pull out China and Brazil, you'll see that that's where the growing demand is coming from. And so the concern is that because the greenhouse gas emissions intensities are so high, that if production really increases in order to respond to that increased demand, the greenhouse gas emissions from Sub-Saharan Africa or South Asia could become significant. The second challenge is that countries are trying to show good. They're trying to show willing with their nationally determined contributions. They're trying to commit to reducing emissions from their growing livestock sectors, because those livestock and other agricultural sectors, because it's so important to their GDP. And so at the moment, much of the discussion and much of the targeting the nationally determined contributions is around emissions reductions. And so they're trying to bring in climate finance to ensure that their agricultural development can continue, would be an answer. So
yeah, so there's another question for you there about methane versus CO2 emissions. What is your take on CO2 equivalents? How much does it matter for the climate impact?
Yes, it does. Yeah, it does. And so some of my colleagues are heavily involved in this debate. So the challenge is that methane is really potent. It's more potent than than just carbon dioxide, but it doesn't stay in the atmosphere as long. So that's why there's now an initiative going on called GWP Star. It's quite contentious. Again, I was just reading something about the debates around it recently, but I think my colleagues would say generally that it is beneficial to separate out methane from nitrous oxide from other kinds of CO2 equivalents. Now there's a question from Michaela. Is this an opportunity to develop co-production of knowledge? Yes, pastoralists have, yes, stocks of knowledge, yeah. So yeah, we have a postdoc working with us on local practices in adapting livestock production to climate change. She's working in 5 sites across Ethiopia, Uganda, and Kenya. And the approach that she and her supervisor, my colleague Todd Crane, are taking is to sort of look at what people are doing now, understand the reasons why they are doing it, work with the broader community in which we find them to say, what do other farmers think about these adaptation practices, and try to build some awareness. Your second question, any increase in conflict in relation to climate change? Yeah, so I'm a real critic of studies that try to attribute increases in conflict just to climate change. I think it's too hard to piece that out. I think that there are many other more direct drivers of conflict in pastoralist systems, including land grabbing, tremendous increase in armed conflict, and without oversimplifying, lots and lots of changes in terms of governance practices around resources, and the clash between more traditional systems and more quote unquote modern forms of governance. And all of this is in the context of populations that still are very marginalized from the political processes in their countries. Now I see a question from Hepe. Are there better ways of producing food from semi-arid rangelands than livestock? Because of their mobility, they're already highly resistant. Yeah, so I mean, Hepe, I think again, it's actually, I mean, there aren't that many studies about the economic returns to other forms of production in rangelands, but the few that do exist show that even if you diversify and bring in some forms of cropping or other kinds of economic activities like beekeeping or harvesting of wild products, livestock make supreme ecological sense in these systems, and they will remain the economic mainstay of arid and semi-arid rangelands for the foreseeable future. Overgrazing narrative in the Sahel. Has that died out? I think the major consensus these days is that many arid and semi-arid rangelands are non-equilibrium systems. And so rather than think about overgrazing, it makes more sense to think about these as systems that ebb and flow in response to precipitation and as response to precipitation mobility, as well as the grazing habits of livestock. I think the bigger challenge is the increasing fragmentation that we see in many rangeland and agropastoral systems, and the increased competition that we see now over resources such as water holes and wetlands. Okay, I think I'm up to date.
Yeah, there is, no. I thought I saw one more, but I didn't. There wasn't. Okay. Are there any more questions at the moment that I don't see? Or
pastoralists are often hard to reach communities for healthcare. Have we been able to explore the impact of different carbon mitigation strategies on human health outcomes? No, this is really interesting. So we are just starting. So again, at ILRI, we work, there is ILRI is renowned for its expertise in zoonotic diseases and in an approach known as One Health, where they try to understand the interactions between livestock health and human health. And what we're seeing now is that our colleagues also want to talk more about environmental health as an increasingly important dimension in animal health and human health. So no, we haven't done any research on this, but I did recently hear of a very interesting project where human health was used as an entry point to improve forest governance. This is a project in Indonesia that I found through that Good Anthropocenes network that I mentioned. So it's maybe an indirect impact of improving human health. And because there's a lot of interest now in thinking of what are other kinds of incentives besides financial to improve farmer or forest dweller natural resource management.
I had a question about equity, and I wonder if you have any reflections on the rural-urban dimension and inequities, and how would these climate impacts on livestock producers? I mean, you mentioned that there are many people who are involved in livelihoods along the value chains, probably serving urban markets. And do you have any reflections on how this rural-urban relationship could be affected by climate change in the livestock value chain, so to speak?
Yeah, I mean, so yeah, there's a lot of concern in general about urbanizing populations and the failure of, or sorry, um, the lack of attractiveness of agricultural livelihoods, particularly to youth, many of whom are migrating into urban areas. So we are encouraged within the CGIAR to think a lot about how to make agriculture a more a higher revenue generating activity, how to make it more attractive to youth. So within the livestock sector, we think about other sort of value addition products that the youth might be interested in engaging in. Fodder value chains are often a very attractive one. Trade in other kinds of livestock products. In terms of equity, I think, the challenge is that people are focused on wealthier urban consumers, and this probably doesn't apply. This doesn't only apply to sub-Saharan Africa. I think it applies to many countries as well. And they're not thinking so much about the implications of changes in those consumption patterns for the livelihoods of the agricultural producers. Yeah.
All right, there are some questions in the chat. Okay. So let's start from after the overgrazing narrative in the Sahel. There is one.
Oh, ranches. Yeah. Yeah, ranches do not really work in arid and semi-arid pastoral systems, Sepsiba, because of the tremendous climate variability, which leads to spatial and temporal variability in terms of water and grazing grass productivity. So that's why over centuries, these systems evolved to be mobile. So yeah, that's my answer there. Somebody's saying, looking at integrating fish farming with intensive livestock production. I don't know. It's certainly, integrating fish farming is a way of diversifying enterprises further. There are ways in which that could make sense from certainly an ecological perspective. From an income perspective, it's often highly risky for farmers to take on something completely new, and I think it depends on the context. I know in Southeast Asia that often fish farming is integrated, for example, with pig production. Another one about studies on the difference of health status among pastoralists and ASF farmers. Yeah, there are a few studies on the contributions of animal source foods to pastoralist food security, and not so much comparing it to farmers that don't keep livestock, but looking at what happens when pastoralists sedentarize and they have less access to milk and meat because they're farther away from the herds, or their diets change. And so it's fairly clear that milk in particular is very important to preventing stunting in pastoralists, small children, and also pregnant and lactating women, and that when milk consumption is reduced in the diet, you do see nutritional outcomes go down. Oh yes, yeah. Okay. Are there any more in the Q&A?
Yeah, there is one.
Okay.
Reflection on Nigeria. Here in Nigeria, there are farmers that have fish pond and poultry in the same place, and wondering if climate could have any impact on both being in the same place. I guess it's related to the previous question.
Yeah, there are quite a few people who would say that diversifying is a smart strategy in the face of climate change, because and often that's why people keep livestock, because if their crops fail, they still have their animals. So livestock are seen as a bit less climate dependent relative to crops. Yeah. And then there's another question about communicating and disseminating research findings to hard to reach pastoralists in a way that may influence decisions they make on the ground. Yeah, so we've spent one of the promising innovations that we've seen is the advent of mobile phones, and the tremendous increase in the number of all kinds of rural people that have access to phones. And so we are doing quite a lot of work around communicating with people on their phones, having interactions with them, getting pastoralists to track market information for us, and then in return we give them information about rangeland conditions or market prices, or connect them to a nearby agri-vet. Yeah, we do quite a lot of work around digital learning. Also gaming. Gaming has become a really interesting way to use your mobile phone to get someone to give you information.
Yeah, you get a question here on does it have any impact on the nutrients recycling? It's sort of connecting back to the previous question.
Yes, it does. Yes,
Yeah.
it does. So, and that's the brilliance of some of the fish farming combined with poultry and pig farming in that I've seen in Southeast Asia. So they actually use the pig manure to in the fish ponds and for the fish to eat. And again, I mean, yes, poultry manure is a very, very valuable soil amendment, very high in nitrogen. So if it's properly managed, it can really enhance soil fertility. And I think the last question, we're about out of time, is can research on livestock farming help lessen the risk of future pandemics from wetland markets? Yes, this is absolutely not my area of expertise, but my colleagues Delia Grace, Hung Nguyen, and a whole team of researchers at ILRI do a tremendous amount of work on food safety in informal meat markets. And I would direct you to the ILRI website, where we have a whole landing page right now on COVID-19 and the research that we do.
Well, thank you very much. I think we would really like to end our lecture on time. Thank you very much for an interesting lecture and for all the questions that we received. And you, I don't know, you are so quick in answering and seeing these all these questions coming up.
I've been spending a lot of time in Zoom chats.
So you are really quick on that. You are getting a lot of thanks here, and it was really, yeah, it was great fun to listen. I agree with Hoover here saying that in the end here. This was a fun lecture.
Thank you.
And has given me a lot to think about.
Okay,
yeah,
great.
know more about fish. So thank you very much, and goodbye, everybody, for today.
Enjoy your evenings.
Yes.